He suffered a stroke, one stroke in Colorado. The train whisked him back to Washington. He suffered an even larger stroke in Washington. And for the last 18 months of his presidency, he was an invalid. The nation had no idea how sick he was. His wife, his physician, and his personal secretary conspired to prevent the American people from knowing that the president was not at all himself. His wife, Edith Wilson, his second wife, his first wife had died. Edith Wilson became, in effect, the acting president of the United States, although no one knew that. She would receive messages from Congress, messages from members of the cabinet, and she said she would take them in to the president, and the president would read them and give his orders, and she would bring them out. But Wilson was too sick to do that. He could hardly speak. He couldn't read very well. He could barely move. He couldn't get out of bed for months. And Edith Wilson, who herself was, she fancied herself a political figure, and she lived in Washington for a long time. So she knew a lot about how the government ran. Edith Wilson may well have been the first woman president of the United States, informally, and at this point women still couldn't vote in federal elections. But anyway, this was the way it was. And the greatest supporter of the League of Nations, the most inspiring leader in American history on the subject of international affairs, was knocked out of the game, with the result that the treaty was left to the tender mercies of Henry Cabot Lodge and the Republican majority in the Senate. The treaty was voted on and defeated. It got a majority, but not a supermajority, not the two-thirds majority. It was voted on again and once more went down. The result was that the United States did not join the League of Nations. The result of that was that the League of Nations was born crippled. The most powerful country on earth remained aloof from the League of Nations. For the next 20 years, potential aggressors knew that the League of Nations was a shadow of what it might have been. For a while, this didn't seem particularly important. During the 1920s, most Americans accepted the conclusion of Henry Cabot Lodge that the First World War had been a mistake, and that the United States should not have gotten involved and therefore should not get involved in future wars of Europe. And Wilson's reputation, which had been at the highest levels during his presidency until his sickness, plummeted. Wilson died in 1924. He never recovered from his stroke. He died in 1924. The nation sort of mourned him, but Democrats and Republicans mostly were simply glad to see him go. Even the Democrats didn't want to talk about him. Franklin Roosevelt had been Woodrow Wilson's Assistant Secretary of the Navy. Franklin Roosevelt was a committed internationalist. He ran for, well, he was on the Democratic ticket in 1920. He was the vice presidential candidate. And he ran as a Wilsonian, as a supporter of the League of Nations and a committed internationalist. And he and the presidential candidate, James Cox, were resoundingly defeated. So Roosevelt didn't have his mind changed by that political outcome, but he realized he had better keep his mouth shut regarding his Wilsonian views. Wilson fell into almost disgrace, and then essentially into oblivion. No one wanted to talk about Woodrow Wilson, not even former members of his cabinet, not even Democrats. And Wilson was essentially a historical non-person, despite the fact that Franklin Roosevelt himself knew, or certainly believed, that Wilson had been exactly right. It's just that American public opinion didn't buy that notion. And historians who wrote about Wilson just gave Wilson the back of their hand. Wilson was this president who had this dream, but the dream was so idealistic and unrealistic that it self-destructed. And so Wilson, if historians and political scientists had conducted a poll of great presidents during the 1920s and 1930s, Wilson would have been somewhere at the bottom. He was an honest soul, a well-meaning soul. So in that regard, he was probably better than, Warren Harding, whose administration just during this time was revealed to have been rife with scandal, and better than Ulysses Grant, who had a scandal-prone administration as well, and better than James Buchanan, who had allowed the Union to fall apart and did nothing about it. But not much above that. But then in the mid-1930s, when the League of Nations, without American support, proved to be utterly ineffective against Japanese aggressions upon China, the Japanese seized Manchuria, sort of the New England of China, the New England and the Ohio Valley of China, the industrialized region of China. The Japanese seized it and created this puppet state of Manchukuo. The League of Nations did nothing. Well, it discussed the issue, and it dithered about the issue, and then it slapped the Japanese on the wrist. And for that mere slap, the Japanese stomped out of the League of Nations saying, "We will have nothing to do with you," and the League of Nations did nothing in response. Adolf Hitler came to power in Germany, and in violation of the Treaty of Versailles began to rearm Germany. Did it surreptitiously at first, then did it openly. In 1937 and 1938, Hitler agitated to seize control of part of Czechoslovakia, the region called the Sudetenland. It was occupied mostly by German-speaking people. And Hitler said that Czechoslovakia is an illegitimate state. It was created by those same people who brought us the Treaty of Versailles. It was crafted out of the remains of the Austrian Empire at the end of the First World War. And it has no legitimacy. And therefore, the German people, acting through my government, through the National Socialist Nazi government, must go to the rescue of our suffering compatriots who are trapped in Czechoslovakia. This was the first direct assault on European sovereignty. This was the opening blow of World War II in Europe. The League of Nations was helpless to do anything about it, and the American people, having followed the advice of Henry Cabot Lodge rather than of Woodrow Wilson, kept their distance. Franklin Roosevelt had learned his lesson in 1920. The American people, they want nothing to do with these troubles. It's generally thought by historians now that if the United States had given its strong support to Britain and France at the Munich Conference of September 1938, where the leaders of the great powers got together with Hitler to deal with this Czech question, the question of Czechoslovakia, because Britain had a treaty guaranteeing the borders of Czechoslovakia. And if the United States had given its strong support to Britain and France, and if united they had stood firm against Hitler and said, "No, this will not happen. If you do this, this means war against the United States," then quite likely Hitler would have been forced to back down. And if he had been forced to back down, the sense of inevitability, the sense of triumph that surrounded Hitler as he went from gamble to successful gamble to successful gamble might have resulted in Hitler's being toppled from power. There might never have been a World War II if the American people had listened to the advice of Woodrow Wilson rather than the advice of Henry Cabot Lodge. And at just about this time, well, not immediately, but as Czechoslovakia was divided, as Hitler, who had promised, "If you give me the Sudeten slice of Czechoslovakia, that's all I want," when it became clear 6 months later that he had been lying through his teeth, when he sent German troops into the rest of Czechoslovakia, as he annexed Austria, and then in September of 1939, as German troops rolled into Poland and the Second European War began, then the American people began to realize, maybe Woodrow Wilson was right. And from that point, Woodrow Wilson's historical stock began to rise.